The First Crusade, an epic of blood and faith. The besieged emperor. The cold autumn winds howled against the great walls of Constantinople when Emperor Alexios Komnenos awoke to fresh news of Seljuk advances. In the gilded throne room, his face was pale as he clutched the tattered letter delivered by an exhausted knight from the eastern frontier. "We must do something," he whispered while his fingers traced invisible lines across the sprawling map before him. "We've lost half of Asia Minor since Manzikert, and if this advance continues," his trusted military advisor John Doukas interrupted, "Your Majesty, we have news from the south as well. The Fatimids in Egypt are preparing to invade Palestine, while the Seljuks in the north threaten Antioch. We're besieged on all fronts." That night, while the city slept under heavy guard, Alexios penned his historic letter to Pope Urban II. Each word weighed like gold. "Most Holy Father, our brothers in the east are bleeding. The Turks defile our churches, slaughter our priests, dishonor our women. We need the knights of the West, your strength, your faith." The priest who wanted to change the world in a modest papal palace in southern France, Pope Urban II studied the Byzantine letter with piercing eyes. Around him gathered cardinals, each awaiting the Pope's opinion with concern. "This is our opportunity," the Pope suddenly declared in his famously deep voice. "An opportunity to unite the Church, strengthen papal authority, and liberate the Holy Land from infidel hands." Cardinal Richard objected, "But Your Holiness, how will we convince Europe's kings to abandon their conflicts and go to war in the East?" The Pope smiled cunningly, "We won't ask the kings. We'll appeal directly to their people. We'll promise them forgiveness, glory, the treasures of the East. And we'll begin here, at Clermont." The madness of faith. The false prophet in a small northern French village, Peter the Hermit, the gaunt monk with burning eyes, delivered his daily sermon to the gathered crowd. His words spread like wildfire. "I have seen in my vision an angel bearing a sword of fire. He commanded me to lead an army of the faithful to Jerusalem. Whoever follows me shall gain the kingdom of heaven." By evening, hundreds of peasants had gathered around him, carrying whatever farming tools they could wield as crude weapons. An old woman lifted her twin children toward Peter. "Take them, Father, let them serve the Lord in his holy war." Thus began what would later be known as the People's Crusade, an army of the hungry, destitute, and criminal who saw in this adventure an escape from wretched lives. Blood on the Rhine's banks. Before crossing into Byzantine territory, the frenzied mob stopped at Rhineland cities, home to Europe's largest Jewish communities. "Why fight Muslims in Jerusalem when Christ's murderers live among us?" shouted one extremist priest. What followed was horrific slaughter. In Mainz, Jews were trapped in the main synagogue. An eyewitness account states, "They screamed for mercy while Crusaders hacked at the doors with axes. When the doors fell, blood flowed through the streets like a river." In Worms, hundreds of Jews were burned alive in their homes. A young Jewish boy tried to flee, but a Crusader grabbed him by the hair and lifted him high. "Behold, even their children are cursed to hell." Before dashing him to the ground, the knights arrived. Meeting in Constantinople. When Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, arrived in Constantinople at the head of his armored army, Emperor Alexios welcomed him with great ceremony. But behind diplomatic smiles, suspicion festered in both men's hearts. At the lavish reception, Alexios tried every means to make Godfrey and other crusade leaders swear fealty. "All lands you reclaim from Muslims must return to the Byzantine Empire," the emperor insisted. But Bohemond of Taranto, the cunning Norman prince, smiled slyly. "We'll consider it, Your Majesty, after we liberate Jerusalem." The Siege of Nicaea was the Crusaders' first true test. The heavily fortified city, seat of Sultan Kilij Arslan, posed a formidable challenge. In the siege's early days, the Crusaders advanced confidently until Seljuk forces emerged from a hidden gate. One knight described the scene. "They came like a flood, their arrows blotting out the sun. I saw my brother fall from his horse, then crushed by our own retreating men." But the Crusaders learned quickly. They built massive siege towers, dug tunnels beneath walls. When they were about to storm the city, Byzantine banners suddenly flew above the walls. The emperor had secretly negotiated the city's surrender, denying Crusaders their plunder and sparking their fury. Book for the Road of Suffering. Mountains of Death. Crossing the Taurus Mountains in autumn 1097 became a nightmare. Early snows, supply shortages, and constant skirmishes with local Turkish forces claimed thousands. Prince Tancred, Bohemon's cousin, wrote in his journal, "Third day without food. Horses dying one by one. Men eating raw flesh. Saw a man weeping as he chewed his boot leather." One night, while exhausted guards slept, Turkish raiders infiltrated the camp. A silent massacre occurred in darkness. At dawn, they found 200 Crusaders slaughtered in their tents. Antioch, the cursed city. The Antioch siege tested strength and will. 8 months of starvation, disease, and despair. A chronicler wrote, "We ate grass, then animal hides, then rats." In final weeks, men fought over a dead dog's corpse. Treachery finally opened the gates. On a rainy night, Armenian guard fighters lowered a rope from a tower. Crusaders climbed silently and opened the gates from within. What followed was horrific slaughter. Even Crusader sources admit, "We killed all in the city, Muslims and Christians alike." Streets ran so deep with blood that horses slipped in it. Jerusalem, dream and nightmare. The final march. By June 1099, the Crusader army had dwindled to human remnants. Of 30,000 who began, only 12,000 exhausted men reached Jerusalem's walls. Raymond of Toulouse, the old count who'd survived all horrors, addressed his weary troops, "Behold! Beyond those walls lies our Lord's tomb. Today we're freed from sin, or die as martyrs." But Jerusalem wouldn't fall easily. High walls, siege equipment shortages, and fierce defense made success seem impossible. Some Crusaders began wondering, was all this for nothing? Blood to the knees. On July 15, 1099, after 5 siege weeks, Crusaders finally breached the walls. What followed surpassed all nightmares. Eyewitness Fulcher of Chartres wrote, "Once inside, we became beasts. We killed all old men, women, children. In Al-Aqsa, hundreds of Muslims gathered, we followed and slaughtered them all. Blood reached our horses' knees." Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir added, "None survived. Even Jews sheltering in synagogues were burned alive. More were killed that day than in all Saladin's wars." After victory, heaven's kingdom on earth. After the massacre, with blood barely dry, Crusaders faced governance. Godfrey of Bouillon refused to be crowned king where Christ wore the crown of thorns, taking only defender of the Holy Sepulchre. But problems emerged quickly. How rule a city whose remaining inhabitants feared them? How administer a kingdom without resources? How counter Muslim threats from Egypt and Syria? The beginning of the end. Within a year, Fatimid armies marched from Egypt. In August 1100, Godfrey died suddenly, perhaps poisoned, and his brother Baldwin crowned himself king of Jerusalem. But true danger came from the north. In Mosul, young Turkish commander Imad ad-Din Zengi prepared for a long war. "Jerusalem won't be forgotten," he often said. "Islam will reclaim it, if it takes a century." A legacy of blood. A century later, when Saladin reclaimed Jerusalem in 1187, the last descendants of original Crusaders departed. But the First Crusade's legacy endured. In Europe, birth of chivalric legends and holy war culture. In Islam, jihad's awakening and unity against invaders. In Jerusalem itself, wounds that remain unhealed today. Was it merely military adventure? Clash of civilizations? Grand political game? History offers no easy answers, but leaves lessons for those who would learn. The First Crusade, a journey of blood and tears. In the winter of 1095, tens of thousands of peasants and knights gathered in a vast field near the French city of Clermont. The cold was biting, and the breath of the attendees rose into the air like white smoke. Standing atop a high wooden platform was a man dressed in luxurious clerical robes, Pope Urban II. He raised his hands, and a heavy silence fell. Then he began the speech that would change the course of history. "My beloved brethren, terrible news has reached me from the east. The heathen Turks are defiling the Holy Land. They slaughter Christian pilgrims. They plunder our churches." A voice from the crowd cried out, "How can we help, Your Holiness?" The Pope answered in a thunderous voice, "Take up the cross. March to Jerusalem. Free the tomb of Christ from the hands of the infidels. Whoever dies on this holy journey shall have all their sins forgiven." The crowd erupted with fervent chants, "Deus vult! Deus vult! God wills it!" The People's Crusade, the beginning of tragedy before the nobles could organize their campaigns. The Peasants' Crusade set out under the leadership of Peter the Hermit, a gaunt man dressed in tattered robes and carrying a large wooden cross. Tens of thousands of poor families and their children followed him, but disaster awaited them in Hungary. When they reached the city of Zeman, they asked the locals for supplies. The Hungarians refused, and the starving Crusaders began looting crops. The chronicler Albert of Aachen wrote, "The peasant Crusaders turned into beasts. They tore bread from children's hands and ripped clothes off women's backs." The Hungarians retaliated with even greater brutality. One night, they locked a group of Crusaders inside a church and burned them alive. The Knights' March, suffering on the road in the autumn of 1096, the prince's armies began their march. Godfrey of Bouillon, the handsome blue-eyed duke, led his troops through the eerie Balkan forests. One rainy night, as madness gripped the camp, a young knight approached Godfrey, trembling, "My lord, the men are eating the carcasses of dead horses. Some are dying from poisoning." Godfrey, pale-faced, replied, "They must endure. Jerusalem awaits us." The Siege of Antioch, hell on earth. When the Crusaders reached Antioch in 1097, they found towering walls that seemed impregnable. The siege lasted 8 grueling months. One night, as Raymond IV inspected his troops, he heard weeping. Approaching, he found a young soldier cradling his friend's corpse. "He starved to death, my lord, and we will follow." But then, a miracle occurred. A monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have had a vision revealing the location of the Holy Lance. After days of digging, they found a rusted spear beneath the church floor. Bohemond of Taranto shouted, "This is a sign from God. Victory is ours." Indeed, days later, they stormed the city. But their joy was short-lived. A massive Turkish army surrounded them. Chronicles say the Crusaders resorted to eating leather straps and tree roots to survive. Jerusalem, the end of the journey. By June 1099, the exhausted army stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The heat was so intense that armor scorched the soldiers' skin. On July 15, they finally breached the city. What followed was a massacre of unimaginable horror. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres wrote, "Knights raced through narrow streets, slaughtering all in their path. Blood flowed through the alleys like rivers. Some soldiers wept as they killed, while others laughed like madmen. In the Jewish quarter, hundreds were barricaded inside a synagogue and burned alive. The victims' screams mingled with Crusaders' hymns of victory. A bitter triumph in the end. Godfrey of Bouillon was crowned the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, though he refused a golden crown, saying, "I cannot wear a crown of gold where my lord wore a crown of thorns." But the cost was staggering. Of the 100,000 who began the journey, only 15,000 reached Jerusalem. This is the true story of the First Crusade, not just a historical event, but a human tragedy of hunger, betrayal, brutality, and blind faith. Blood on the gates of heaven, how Jerusalem's victory shook Europe's conscience. On a cold autumn morning in 1100, the monk Adhemer de Montiel stood trembling before the doors of Lupuy Cathedral, tears in his eyes as he whispered, "I saw it. I saw Jerusalem bleeding." A year after returning from the East, this man who had lost his mind on the journey back would scream every night as if reliving a recurring nightmare. Bells melting with joy in Rome. The bells didn't just ring, they screamed, as the poet Guibert de Nogent described. The great cathedrals exhausted themselves in 3 continuous days of ringing. On Paris's Rue de Saint-Jacques, windows shattered from the violent clashing of bells. Nuns at Fontevraud Abbey in Provence recorded in their diaries, "We had to mop the floors hourly from pilgrims urinating in excitement." Children vanishing in the night. In a small village near Toulouse, Father Pierre awoke to a woman's screams, "My son! They've stolen my son!" At the church door, dozens of small shoes were neatly arranged. A message on the wall read, "We'll free the little Christ before the big one." Later, children aged 10 to 12 were found at Marseille's port trying to steal a boat to reach the Holy Land. The Market of Holy Corpses. In Genoa, a miracle market emerged where every stone allegedly from Jerusalem sold for its weight in gold. Most astonishingly, Jewish merchant Yaakov ben Eliezer noted in his memoirs, "Today they sold a molar they claimed belonged to St. George." How could they know it was his? The madness escalated to selling vials of air from Golgotha. Generals without armies. Count Raymond de St. Gilles returned to Europe to find his castle occupied by relatives. At Toulouse's court, he roared, "I left my eye in Antioch, my foot in Jerusalem, and you steal my property?" The court ruled against him because he was no longer the same man after adopting Eastern habits like daily bathing, letters from hell. The younger brother of Knight Godfrey de Bouillon received a letter written in blood, "My dear brother, Jerusalem is beautiful as hell. Each day we discover we're not heroes but invaders." This letter mysteriously disappeared from the Vatican archives. Poets selling lies at a festival in Champagne. Poet Marc de Lorraine sang of grapevines bearing ready-to-drink wine in Jerusalem. When questioned by a returning pilgrim, he replied, "The people want dreams, not truths." When the victors wept in strict secrecy, Cardinal Giuffrido wrote a confidential report to the Pope. 70% of returnees suffer nightmares, 20% lost their faith, and 10% dream of returning east as if it were home. The report ended up burned. A victory without heroes. A decade after the Great Victory, Europe lived a strange paradox. The more they celebrated Jerusalem, the further its spirit retreated from them. The writer Heloise observed profoundly, "We lost our innocence when we discovered heaven could be built with innocent blood." Blood on the gates of heaven, the forgotten massacres of the First Crusade. The thick fog enveloped the Rhine River on that fateful May morning in 1096. In the German town of Speyer, a mob of peasant crusaders gathered outside the home of Rabbi Yaakov ben Yaakov. They carried axes and scythes, their eyes burning with that peculiar mix of religious fervor and greed that would come to define the First Crusade's darkest hours. The air smelled of damp earth and impending violence. Rabbi Yaakov heard their shouts through the leaded glass window, the same window his grandfather had brought from Jerusalem decades earlier. "Open up! We've come to save your souls," a voice cried, followed by the sickening thud of a fist against oak. The rabbi's hands trembled as he clutched his 7-year-old granddaughter Leah closer, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his chest. Just last Sabbath, travelers had brought news of massacres in Worms, whole Jewish quarters put to the sword, scrolls burned in the streets, children dashed against stones. "Grandfather," Leah whispered, her wide brown eyes reflecting the candlelight, "why are they so angry with us?" Before he could answer, the door shuddered under another blow. The rabbi kissed his granddaughter's forehead, tasting salt from both their tears, and hid her in the wine cellar behind a cask of Passover wine. "Count to 1,000, my light," he instructed, forcing a smile. "Then it will all be over." The door gave way with a splintering crash. Sunlight streamed through the broken timbers, illuminating the dust motes that swirled like ghosts around the silhouettes of armed men. Their leader, a hulking peasant named Volkmar, had painted a crude cross in what appeared to be blood across his forehead. "Accept Christ or die," he roared, spittle flying from cracked lips. From upstairs came a scream that turned the rabbi's blood to ice, his wife Esther. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his arthritic knees protesting, to find 3 men dragging her by her silver braids toward the balcony. One had already torn her dress open to the waist. "Esther!" "No," the rabbi cried, but even as he reached for her, the youngest of the attackers, a boy no older than 16 with pockmarked cheeks, lifted Esther with terrifying ease and threw her over the balustrade. The rabbi would remember forever the sound her body made hitting the cobblestones 3 stories below, like a melon splitting open in the market. The stench of death permeated Antioch's walls in June 1098, 8 months into the siege that had reduced the great city to a charnel house. Raymond of Toulouse, his once fine armor now dull with grime and blood, picked his way through streets running red with effluent and worse. The Crusaders had broken through at dawn, and now the morning sun illuminated scenes that would haunt Raymond's dreams for decades. A group of his own soldiers had gathered around a cooking fire in what had been a wealthy merchant's home. As Raymond approached, his stomach rumbling despite the omnipresent stench, he noticed the meat bubbling in the cauldron had an unfamiliar shape. One of the men, a Norman knight named Gautier, lifted a dripping haunch with his dagger and grinned at his commander. "Join us, my lord? The infidels make for tender eating." Raymond's gorge rose as he recognized the small, delicate foot still attached to the leg, a woman's, probably no older than his own daughter back in Toulouse. He turned away just in time to vomit into the gutter, his body convulsing even after his stomach was empty. Behind him, the men laughed and continued their feast, one of them joking that this was truly the body of Christ. The December cold bit deep when the Crusaders reached Maara in 1098, their numbers swollen with desperate camp followers and the dregs of Europe. Bohemond of Taranto stood on a hill overlooking the city that had surrendered after a brief siege, watching as his men poured through the gates like a biblical plague. What followed would be whispered about even among the hardened veterans of the Crusade. In one house, a Muslim family huddled together, the father Ahmed, a scribe by trade, clutching a kitchen knife while his wife Miriam tried to quiet their 3 children. Through the shuttered windows came the sounds of slaughter, the high-pitched screams of women, the wet thud of blades meeting flesh, the drunken laughter of men who had long since abandoned any pretense of holiness. "Remember the surahs I taught you," Ahmed whispered to his children as the door shook under heavy blows. To his wife, he said only, "Forgive me," before drawing the knife across each child's throat in turn, his tears mingling with their blood. When the Crusaders finally broke down the door, they found the entire family dead, arranged neatly as if sleeping, the father's hand still clutching the knife embedded in his own chest. On July 15, 1099, Tancred of Hauteville was among the first through the breach in Jerusalem's walls. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where hundreds had sought refuge, Tancred watched in horror as his fellow Crusaders transformed into something less than human. The young knight, no older than 20, was systematically dashing infants' heads against the marble columns while singing a hymn to the Virgin. Nearby, 2 sergeants had pinned down an elderly imam and were slowly skinning him alive, arguing about whether his screams sounded more like a goat or a pig. The floor had become so slick with blood that men kept slipping as they went about their butchery. Tancred stumbled outside, gasping for air, and found himself at the western wall. There, to his astonishment, he saw Godfrey of Bouillon, the Crusade's most respected leader, weeping openly as he clutched a scrap of parchment. When Tancred approached, Godfrey wordlessly handed him the note. It was from a Jewish mother to her children, written in elegant Hebrew characters now smudged with blood, expressing her hope that they would meet again in the world to come. 2 years later, Godfrey lay dying in Jerusalem, the city he had helped conquer at such terrible cost. The once mighty warrior was now a gaunt shadow of himself, his body racked by fever and his mind by visions. To Brother Pierre, the Cluniac monk attending him, Godfrey confessed in a voice raw with anguish, "We came to liberate the Holy Land, but instead we have crucified Christ anew with every innocent life we took." As the end neared, Godfrey insisted on being carried to the roof of his palace, where he could see the Temple Mount shimmering in the midday heat. His last words, whispered so softly that Brother Pierre had to lean close to hear them, were, "When history judges us, let them say we were monsters. For only monsters could have done what we did in God's name." The wind carried his soul away even as the muezzin's call to prayer echoed across the blood-stained stones of Jerusalem, a city that had seen too much holiness and not enough humanity. The ghost of Jerusalem haunts the Pope, Urban II's hidden transformation in the shadowed halls of the Lateran Palace. Pope Urban II knelt before a golden crucifix, but his eyes were not fixed on the Savior. They were locked onto a dried bloodstain on the hem of his white robe. It was the 3rd night in a row the nightmares had come. The letter that shook the papal throne. Cardinal Giuffrido entered, carrying a leather scroll bound with red silk. "Your Holiness, this arrived from Jerusalem with the last caravan." With trembling hands, the Pope broke the seal. The letter was from Tancred de Hauteville, describing in brutal detail how the blood in David's street reached the horses' knees, and how we burned hundreds of Jews alive in their synagogue. Urban recoiled as if scalded. "This is not what I commanded. I called for Jerusalem's liberation, not its desecration." The secret meeting in the Vatican gardens on a fog-shrouded night, the Pope summoned Bishop Adhemer de Montiel, the sole surviving leader of the Antioch campaign, now a gaunt shadow of the man he once was. "Tell me the truth, Adhemer. What have we done?" The bishop collapsed to his knees, weeping. "Your Holiness, I saw our own soldiers skinning Muslim children and roasting them over fires, all while screaming Christ's name." The secret decrees in the following days, Urban moved like a man trying to extinguish an inferno. 1. The Emergency Council of Bishops, in a locked chamber, he gave an unscripted speech. From this day forward, any march to the east must be under clerical control. No more peasants, only disciplined knights. 2. The letter to the Byzantine emperor, a masterwork of evasion. Most noble emperor, circumstances have changed. We must reconsider our agreements. 3. The Templar mandate. He ordered the creation of a strict military order, telling its leaders, "You are not mere soldiers, but warrior monks. Every sword stroke must be a prayer." The final night on the eve of his death, Urban summoned his scribe for a strange dictation. "Write this. When children weep in Jerusalem, the angels hear them in Rome. Their blood stains our white vestments. Perhaps our sin was believing God wanted rivers of blood to reclaim his house." By dawn, the Pope was found dead at his prayers, eyes wide open, still witnessing horrors only he could see. On his desk, a map of Jerusalem lay torn into 4 pieces, each speckled with tiny drops of blood. Aftermath. 10 years later, Cardinal Giuffrido burned Urban's secret archives in the Vatican crypt. Among the smoldering parchments, one half-scorched letter survived. "If I could turn back time, I would rather Jerusalem remain in Muslim hands 1,000 times over than become a graveyard by our doing." Thus, the greatest victor in papal history became its most tormented penitent, a prisoner of his own bloody triumph. Blood and Gold, the complete story of the First Crusade in the dimly lit bishop's palace at Clermont, where candlelight flickered against the stone walls. Pope Urban II sat staring at the pile of financial documents cluttering his desk. His weary fingers traced the dark ink figures: 3 tons of silver owed to Lion banks, late interest payments to Genoese moneylenders. Outside the window, the cries of starving peasants rose from the town square. The acrid smell of burnt bread hung in the cold air. The Pope sighed as he heard a woman scream, "My children are starving to death." In a small village in northern France, peasant Jacques dragged his feet through the scorched wheat field. For 3 years the land had failed to yield. His wife Marie was hiding their last handful of wheat for their 3 children. "The village lord demands taxes tomorrow," Marie whispered anxiously. Jacques looked up at the rainless sky. "I heard the Pope is calling people to go east, where the land flows with milk and honey." That night, as his children cried from hunger, Jacques made his decision. He would sell his only cow to buy a rusty sword from the black market. He would become a crusader. In a Norman castle, young noble Robert pounded his fist on the oak table. "My younger brother inherited everything, and I have nothing but this worn-out sword." His old servant Theodore approached cautiously. "My lord, a message arrived from Rome. The Pope promises lands in the east to those who take the cross." The following week, Robert was signing documents to sell his last piece of land to a Jewish merchant. "I'll return rich," he said as he counted the few gold coins he received for his family's inheritance. In the Italian port of Pisa, wealthy merchants gathered in a secret cellar. Marino, the most famous silk trader, raised his wine glass. "You've heard the Pope's call. This is our golden opportunity." "But how?" asked his younger partner. Marino spread a map on the table. "We'll finance ships for the Crusaders, and in return we'll control eastern trade routes." In the corner, Jewish banker Isaac calculated expected profits on his wax tablet. "We'll loan money to knights for the journey, and when they return, we'll seize their lands if they can't repay." On the morning of November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II stood on a high wooden platform in a field outside Clermont. Thousands of starving peasants and bankrupt nobles gathered to hear him. "Dearest brothers," he cried in his booming voice. "The Turks are defiling the Holy Land. Whoever goes to liberate it will have all sins forgiven." The crowd cheered, "Deus vult. God wills it." What the crowd didn't know was that the Pope had signed a secret agreement with Italian merchants the week before. In exchange for financing the crusade, they would receive trade privileges in any conquered territories. 2 years later, in the besieged streets of Antioch, Knight Godfrey of Bouillon watched his starving men slaughtering a stray dog for food. "This is no longer a holy war," he whispered to himself. In one hut, he discovered a group of his soldiers cooking the flesh of a Muslim woman. "She's just an infidel," one justified with a mad grin. In Jerusalem, when the Crusaders breached the walls, victory turned to massacre. Tancred of Hauteville saw a Jewish child hiding beneath the altar of Al-Aqsa Mosque. "Please," the child begged. But a soldier grabbed him by the hair and slit his throat immediately. 5 years later, Robert of Normandy returned to Europe. But instead of the promised riches, he found Genoese merchants had seized all his property for unpaid debts. In Rome, the new Pope Paschal II uncovered the scandal. Most of the holy relics brought from the East were fakes. "We've been deceived," he cried as he examined a wooden pendant claimed to be from the true cross. 20 years later, old peasant Jacques sat in a field of green wheat. The new agricultural techniques Crusaders brought from the East made the land fertile as never before. In Venice's harbor, merchant Marino's grandson counted gold from his trade with Egypt. "Walls may crumble, but trade endures," he said while signing a contract with a Muslim merchant. At Cluny Abbey, an elderly monk wrote in a manuscript, "The crusade began in God's name, but became a lust for gold." Yet from all this bloodshed, a new Europe was born. Perhaps this was God's true will. In a monastery cell, Pope Urban II lay on his deathbed. His glazed eyes stared at the crucifix on the wall. "Was it worth all this blood?" he whispered before breathing his last. Thus the First Crusade transformed from a religious calling into the greatest economic revival of the Middle Ages. But the price of this revival was tens of thousands of lives, and scars on the human conscience that remain unhealed to this day. The economic collapse that paved the way for holy war. On a bitter winter night in 1094, Jewish merchants gathered in secret within the German city of Mainz. Rabbi Yaakov ben Eliezer pored over the massive ledger before him, his eyes widening in horror as he read the figures. "Wheat now costs its weight in gold, and people are eating corpses in the streets." Outside the window, the sounds of rioting grew louder as a mob of starving peasants attempted to storm the monastery granaries. In the bishop's palace, Bishop Herman argued with local nobles. "The peasants have sold their children to Jewish slavers for food. What will we do when no one remains to work the land?" Europe was experiencing its worst economic crisis in centuries, the collapse of the feudal system due to repeated division of lands among heirs, the Great Famine that killed a third of northern France's population, rampant inflation that rendered coinage virtually worthless. Part 2. The Pope besieged by debt in Rome. Pope Urban II faced his own financial crisis. The papal account books revealed debts to Jewish bankers in Lyon totaling 3,000 silver marks, loans from Genoese merchants at 120% annual interest, overdue taxes from dioceses across Europe. Cardinal Giuffrido, head of the papal treasury, delivered a grim report: "Unless we repay these debts by spring, the Holy See will lose all its Tuscan holdings." During a fateful night meeting with his cardinals, the debate grew heated. "We must find new sources of wealth," declared Cardinal Richard. "But where?" "Europe is bankrupt," countered Cardinal Odo. Then Bishop Adhemer proposed his bold solution: "The East, the treasures of Byzantium and the Islamic world." Part 3. Economic planning for the Crusade. The financial planning for the Crusade took 2 full years. Secret Vatican documents reveal, financing the campaign, a special crusade tax imposed on all dioceses, indulgences sold at exorbitant prices, massive loans from Jewish bankers using church lands as collateral, economic incentives. Participants granted rights to plunder all Crusaders' debts, to be forgiven land grants in the East for disinherited nobles, commercial investments, secret agreements with Italian cities for naval support, promises of trade privileges in eastern ports, arms deals with weapons merchants. Part 4. The Crusades' shadow economy. The reality of the campaign differed dramatically from the lofty religious rhetoric. Arms trade. Pisan and Genoese merchants sold weapons to both sides. Sword prices increased 500% during the Crusade. Muslim traders in Antioch supplied Crusaders for gold. Slavery. Over 50,000 Muslim and Jewish prisoners sold as slaves. Slave markets in Cyprus and Crete flourished. Some knights specialized in slave trading rather than fighting organized plunder. Treasures from mosques and churches sold in Europe. Priceless manuscripts and artifacts looted from Levantine libraries. Even saints' tombs were raided for. Holy relics sold at outrageous prices. Part 5. Unintended economic consequences. When the Crusaders returned, they brought economic transformations that changed Europe. Commercial revolution. First banking systems inspired by Islamic finance. Widespread use of checks and bills of exchange. Establishment of the first trade exchanges in Italian cities. Agricultural revolution. New irrigation techniques from the East. Introduction of cotton and sugar cane. Dramatic improvements in farm productivity. Monetary crisis. Influx of Islamic gold caused hyperinflation. Collapse of local European currencies. Social unrest from skyrocketing prices. Part 6. The Church's hidden secrets. Recently discovered documents reveal secret deals with Muslims. Some Crusader leaders traded with their enemies. Covert commerce between Jerusalem and Cairo. Massive bribes paid to allow Muslim pilgrims access to holy sites. Financial corruption. Church leaders embezzled Crusade funds. Military and religious positions sold in the East. Donation money diverted to personal investments. The Great Deception. Most holy relics brought to Europe were fakes. A thriving trade in forged religious artifacts. Some churches paid fortunes for counterfeit relics. Conclusion. Lessons learned centuries after the First Crusade. We can discern crucial lessons. Holy wars often mask economic interests. Religion served as cover for material greed. Spiritual rhetoric concealed profit calculations. This pattern continues in modern conflicts. Economics is history's hidden engine. Financial crises create conditions for war. Commercial interests shape unlikely alliances. Wealth changes hands under religious pretexts. Unintended consequences. What began as economic salvation transformed the world order. Cultural exchange proved more significant than military outcomes. Some economic benefits lasted centuries beyond the Crusades. In the end, the First Crusade reveals an uncomfortable truth. History's greatest transformations are often driven not by noble ideals, but by cold financial calculations. As a Byzantine merchant wrote in his memoirs, I saw the Crusaders pray in church by morning, and count their gold by evening. Cultural and religious impacts of the First Crusade, a clash of civilizations that sparked profound transformations. When the Crusaders returned from the East, they brought not only material plunder but also ideas and cultures that forever changed the face of Europe and the Middle East. These transformations spread like shockwaves through both Christian and Islamic worlds. 1. The Crusaders' cultural shock in the East. Discovery of an advanced civilization. The Crusaders were astonished by surprised face. Regular public baths, while Europe considered bathing dangerous to health. Modern hospitals like Jerusalem's Al Maristan performing complex surgery. Tripoli's library containing 3 million manuscripts, more than all European libraries combined. Adoption of Eastern customs. Surprised face. Nobles began wearing silk and brocadeo. Heavy use of spices in cooking. Imitation of Turkish bath systems in Sicily. 2. Profound religious impacts in the Christian world. Surprised face. Unprecedented emergence of relic veneration. 850 alleged fragments of the true cross were sold. Creation of the chivalry system blending Christian and Arab values. St. George transformed into an English national symbol after Jerusalem battles in the Islamic world. Surprised face. Escalation of jihadist rhetoric as responsio. Emergence of radical religious movements like the Almohads in Morocco. Beginning of long sectarian tensions about responsibility for the defeat. 3. Unexpected scientific exchange. Transfer of Arab knowledge. Surprised face. Translation of 2,000 scientific books from Arabic in Toledo. Discovery of works by Avicenna and Al-Razi in Medici. Learning algebraic mathematics from Muslim scholars. Military developments. Surprised face. European adoption of mobile siege tower. Sword-making improvements using Damascus stilo. Later transfer of gunpowder technology. 4. Transformations in art and architecture. Crusader churches, blended. Surprised face. European Gothico-Islamic Arcaso Byzantine decorations. Eastern influences on art. Surprised face. Appearance of Oriental carpets in religious painting. Use of vibrant colors inspired by Islamic mosaic. Development of European calligraphy arts. 5. Demographic and linguistic changes. Emergence of Franks in the East. Surprised face. Intermarriage between Crusaders and local women. Birth of the Frankish dialect, French-Arabic mix. Transformation of Jerusalem into multicultural city. Arabic words entering English. Surprised face. Sugar, sucker, cotton, cut, magazine, moccasin. 6. Consequences for interfaith relations. Decline of religious tolerance. Surprised face. Persecution of Jews in post-Crusade Europe. Harsher laws against Muslims in Spain. Emergence of Inquisition as reaction to external threat. Historical paradoxes. Surprised face. Some Crusaders secretly converted to Islam. European priests studied the Quranic gift exchanges between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. Conclusion. A contradictory legacy. As Arab historian Usama ibn Munkid wrote in his memoirs, they came as warriors, but left as knowledge seekers. While the Crusades left deep wounds, they also wove cultural threads that unexpectedly connected East and West. This paradoxical legacy remains visible today in Gothic architecture with Eastern influences. Modern banking systems inspired by Muslim financiers. The civilizational dialogue that began with conflict but led to exchange.